So, dear Suzy, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. You are a major artist of the Canadian art scene, but also a very influential woman artist who left her mark on the international art scene, and this since the 70s. You are an image maker whose work is rooted in performance, acting, role-playing, but also in personal archives and cultural history. You achieved a revolution of the issues at stake in self-portraiture, and this not only opened new creative space for other women, but it now clearly is considered as part of the Occidental avant-garde feminism of the 70s. Your life and work has been described and analyzed by Erin Silver in the most recent monography dedicated to you and published by Art Canada Institute that we can see online. It is important to mention, amongst your many exhibitions, three major monographic exhibitions you had in 93 at the Canadian Museum of Contemporary Photography, a point of reference, at the Art Gallery of Ontario, introducing Suzy Lake in 2014, and more recently at the Image Center in Toronto, following the Scotiabank Photography Award you won for your outstanding contribution to photography in Canada. You are represented by Georgia Sherman in Toronto and Michel Didier in Paris and Brussels. While we are recording this conversation, you have a solo show at Galerie Michel Didier, and it will be the occasion for us to speak about some of the works that aren't shown at this gallery now, but also to speak about others. Because of the nature of your work, playing with the awareness of the gaze all the time, let's remind to the spectator watching our conversation now that we are looking at each other while a camera is filming us on the side, and I am in Paris while you are in Toronto. So the camera is not filming in the same space, and the spectator is looking at a reconstructed conversation, even though we're having it face-to-face, you and me now. So your entire work since the 70s is based on that optical and reflective geometry in the space that connects you, someone outside the frame, the viewer, often a mirror, and almost always the camera. The awareness of that confusing geometry in space allows you to provoke a constant crossover between reality, illusion, and representation. As we have the chance to have you with us today, I would like to start by asking you to comment one of the most interesting work that you started with in the 70s, Imitation of Myself.
It was really very important for me to perform the work for the camera as a photographic piece in terms of the notion of role-playing, the notion of masking, notions of the tabula rasa, which women have really had to address regularly through their lifetime. Imitations of Myself #1 and 2 were photographed in my studio, and I was a young photographer. I didn't realize the effects of fluorescent light on the slide film that I was using. So, of course, when the film was processed, the images were so acrid that I couldn't use them. And I re-photographed it in a different location. And that piece is called A Genuine Simulation Of, wherein I start out with putting white face on my face, and then as the tabula rasa. That's the beginning. I have a mime background, so that was a very natural thing for me to go back to zero, and I would be putting women's makeup on top of my white face. And as it accumulated, even though it was a natural amount of makeup, the layering with the white face underneath it became a mask. So it was like the the construct of putting my own face on my face. Years later, I discovered those acrid slides, and they were wonderful other than the color. And with the digital process, I could actually correct that color and then, in fact, produce imitations 1 and 2.
So when we look at those three works, at that series of work that are intimately related, what I find interesting, amongst many interesting things, is the fact that in some of them, the camera is like looking over you, and you're near a kitchen corner, and in genuine simulation of the camera is more at your level, and at the end of the grid, the last image shows like a reversal. We see the camera suddenly is showing the mirror in which you are reflecting your image. So that is an interesting shift and change also in the scenography of that action, or performance, if you call it this way. I don't know. Yes.
Well, the imitations 1 and 2 that were printed in 2012, it seemed to me the work didn't need to have that didactic finale. They were all shot at the same time, but because I could not clarify the color back then, the printing of them was delayed until much later, when digital came in and I could perform that function to remedy the color balance on the images.
Of course, it's a really gendered, also a very gendered image too. And I don't know if I can go on that ground, but I would say that when we consider, the whole history of representation of women, I think it's quite interesting that we see you doing makeup in a kitchen, because it's suddenly as if, you were ironically diverting something like the function of the kitchen that becomes suddenly a backstage theater, or the studio of the woman artist. Can you is it correct to say that? Or?
Oh, definitely. In fact, the problem that women were having with making work back in the early 70s was not just if they were referencing their bodies or their gender, or they could be dealing with the most male aesthetic, is that the minute that the woman's image is in frame, the thing is that the male gaze takes over. And so for me, in that early work, it was really important that with all the social and political change that was going on back at that time, that we were actively working against. It was a condition where we knew what we weren't, but we weren't quite sure what we were. And so by using the element of a misrepresentation to invert that so that a new representation could come forward, I used that. But the male gaze persisted so much that it made sense to elevate it and throw back the male gaze, use those materials to actually bring forward something behind it.
You will be also working on those issues in a different way in Miss Châtelaine. That is one of the works that is being shown at Michel Didier's exhibition. You are playing the younger girl. You have like the schoolgirl outfit that you are wearing, and you are mimicking attitudes of a younger woman. And this is used to represent the adult woman, the Miss Châtelaine woman, this is another also very dangerous ground on which you are playing, about representing the woman and the girl all together in that image.
Well, I mean, magazines, film, media of that time formed a consumer culture that was an imposition on all women. So to, in fact, take elements out of consumer culture to adopt on the image with the white face, the tabula rasa, the rupture between the two, I realized that oftentimes the influences on our being occur so slowly that you don't realize it until after the fact. And so it makes youth culture and consumer culture so dangerous. And but back in those days, it was the kind of thing that I felt that I had to present that work in a little bit more of a playful manner, that addressing those issues directly were too political, which is almost laughable now. But back then it was a means to, how can I tell my story to someone that they're not ready to hear? And so that playfulness came and went in that early work as a device for discussion.
And is the use of black and white here a very important aspect of it? The fact that it's creating also a distance. It is playful, absolutely, because also we have to say that it's small. We see, it's not magnified portraits. It's very small portraits presented in a grid again. So my question is about the black and white here, because as you did some works in color and those in black and white, this one is strongly black and white.
It's by virtue of referencing the media. In the 70s, we saw a lot more black and white work than we did in terms of in color. And I mean, the work that came just before that would be Co-ed magazine. I could see them as single images enough so that when I actually worked into the larger grid, I could in fact be more playful by using hats and brooches and so on. So my work is always kind of, how can I test the edges a little bit further than the one from before? Yeah.
In the works we just talked about, the real Suzy Lake disappears in a stage character, endorsing a diversity of codes, a diversity of gazes and physical attitudes. But you are not exposing yourself in those work. You are, let's say, I would say on the contrary, exposing the artificiality of all the images we give of ourselves. And that question of showing the true self, or the impossibility to show the true self, is something central in your work, in all your work, I think. So I was going to ask you, if we think about on stage, that is really a magnificent work that existed in as a slideshow and that exists now as a grid on the wall. Is this like the story of a quest for you on stage?
At the time of production, it was a reaction to the kind of representation of women that I was rebelling against. And so the symptoms of that irritation of what my generation had become or was becoming wasn't being represented. So those symptoms kept building some sense of a resistance. So I thought that it would be important to mimic it in order to actually name it and move on. So the slideshow in effect, was done 3 times. Given that there wasn't much of interest by the gallery audience in feminist work, the first time that I showed the slideshow, it was met with accusations of narcissism and, you know, women's work between, and women's work was said between clenched teeth. And so I didn't, you know, I was a young enough artist, I didn't know whether to discriminate that in terms of anti-feminist bias, or that I hadn't done my job as an artist, and I, you know, went back and made a second version. And then I went back and made a third version. And the second version, I'm pretty sure the order was that I included photographs of me applying the white face, thinking that, oh, well, they're going to really understand that it's about identity issues if I go back to the tabula rasa reference and have those juxtaposed with, you know, the modeling, which was, I did not try to do those modeling shots as though they were skilled fashion photos. I did them as someone that was imitating them. There are flaws, you know, there's an awkwardness in some of the movements, but it's still referencing what I was seeing in the magazine. And of course, you know, with still the male gaze made it very, very difficult for my audience to actually read that I'm talking about identity. I'm not talking about beauty. I'm talking about the resistance in terms of what we're told is beauty. And so that's when I added the image and text slides, where it literally comes out and declares the notions that this is about role playing, that we are a multiplicity of who we have become over time, and that was really important. That kind of work wasn't still of interest to the general public until Connie Butler, in fact, formed the WAC exhibition for a tour around North America. And that changed everything, because all of a sudden now there was an interest to build a language to be able to discuss that work. I mean, when I was interviewed as a young artist, the interviewers had great difficulty then going back and writing the essay, wherein they may have found what I was doing very interesting, but in terms of art language, there wasn't a language to deliver it to the public. And so very little literature or publications were done on that work back in the early 70s. But with the WAC exhibition, all of a sudden there was an announcement of how continuous this was throughout the world, of women trying to actually find a voice and make a language, a visual language representing this work.
What you say is amazing. It's tragic in a way, and it's fantastic also, because it means that also a very powerful and strong and very innovative work of art can be so critical that it cannot be accepted because there's not the intellectual context to accept it, which is really what happened with that work.
Well, thank you. But, you know, I mean, it was work that I had to do anyway. I mean, making work is really how I come to terms with the world. When I start feeling what I'm resisting to, and it builds to actually, it builds and then distills to a position that I can understand, then making the work allows me the time in terms of orchestrating it visually, that everything is information, and all of a sudden when I see how I'm pulling all of these informations together, I'm learning more about the question that I'm asking while I'm in production of the work, and understanding my own urgency. So as I said, it's making work is really how I come to terms with the world, and whether I have an audience or not.
We will look at another series that is maybe not the true Suzy Lake either, that was performing haute couture. So this was about fashion, and I put it right after because we were talking about all the ambiguity of the fashion images that were included in maybe not ambiguous for you, but for many people, ambiguity of the fashion images in on stage. And years later, decades later, and you produce Performing Haute Couture, which is a very severe image of yourself. It's a self-portrait, but it's not playful at all. It's like a monochrome of gray in a very dark and plain background. What's interesting is I read somewhere that you asked a male photographer to do those images.
Miguel Jacob is a Toronto fashion photographer, and Miguel Jacob approached me because he was doing a spread for a magazine where they wanted to introduce the contemporary older woman, and he asked me to model for this spread. Well, I thought that it was really quite peculiar and wonderful at the same time, because as opposed to on stage being the youth, anger, dealing with representation, I was an older woman dealing with issues of ageism at a time where I'm still feeling I'm very productive and I still have something to say. And I agreed to be a part of this magazine spread, which was an interesting thing because it was a short tribute to the older woman that in the fashion world that seemed to last about like 8 months of interest showing older women in there. But it piqued my interest in terms of what high fashion was about, and it was about beyond what we would see as a normal consumer, and how beautiful and architectural some of the fashion was. And I went to some of the major shops in Toronto that carried brands like Victor and Rolf or Comme des Garçons, and was very, very impressed with the clothing, just to look at it. And immediately I could see, as a former mimist, how I could perform, not wear their clothing, but perform their clothing. My surprise with the Comme des Garçons shoot was afterwards when I was printing it and in a larger scale. My grandfather introduced German Expressionism to me when I was very, very young, and the photograph that I had shot and chosen to use for haute couture reminded me of the Max Beckmann portrait that's hanging in Harvard Library, where he's leaning against the fireplace. His portrait has such a confidence that nears arrogance, and I thought, with all of the anxiety of youth on stage, here I am as an older woman posed with that sense of confidence, the confidence that we should all have, that, you know, standing there, that I could actually be performing and yet be so anchored and centered in terms of my purpose in that photograph. There wasn't the intention to refer to a male representation of confidence or arrogance, so that I could actually take that strength and present it on my own terms, you know, as a woman, without the reference of I'm just as good as a man. It's like there's a strong woman in that photograph, despite the fact that, you know, there's an older body, the fact that I was skinny all my life, and for the first time I'm photographed with a little bit of a Rubens tummy kind of peeking out from under the morning coat. I I love those photographs. I absolutely love those photographs. And so that's what I say, that, you know, with all the intentions of things that I'm looking for when I start making work, and then I'm asking more questions and I'm looking for more things, by responding to that and then orchestrating little things in terms of choice of color, position in the camera, even formal qualities or conceptual qualities. My work is starting to tell me more than I ever expected. I, you know, really enjoy working in the studio.
So this, and I hear you, you know, what you say about the Max Beckmann reference, and again, that's very strong, because of course you totally appropriate something in this performing haute couture. It's like those images, because they are big images also, you know, they're very imposing physically. It's like, for me, so you succeeded, I think, because for me it's like the era of a woman. It's like the end of the era of woman as object of desire for the male gaze. We will finish this conversation with a reference to cinema that is very important for you, but in which you are also appropriating a male character. Those works maybe are not discussed together normally, but because of that and the reference to cinema, we will do that now. It's Lipstick on the Lido, that is also in Michel Didier's exhibition, and the famous Are You Talking to Me? How do you see that appropriation of a strong and very well-known male role in those references?
In Taxi Driver, where he's starting to lose touch with reality while he's driving, and then he gets into the bathroom. It doesn't matter who it is that's performing. It was so effective when he was going, "Are you talking to me? Are you talking to me? I don't see anybody else here. Are you talking to me?" In that film, it felt like he was coming off the screen and coming down, and with 600 people in the theater, he was only talking to me. And I thought, oh my God, if I could do that, because I was interested in that audience-performance relationship. So I constructed it by almost like a little bit of a self-hypnosis, where I took photographs of myself talking about trauma, because I wanted to record that point, such as De Niro, when he actually broke with reality and what that looked like. And I had to do it a number of times, because when it was real, it actually really looked fake. And how did I deal with that? So I dealt with that by heating and stretching the negatives to have that sense that the individual was being manipulated, and doing glaze painting on the photograph, the black and white photograph, to create a rhythm that, you know, trying to retouch a reality that's distorted. And so that's my reference to Taxi Driver, and it was my interest to really make the photograph perform as an experience for the audience. The Thomas Mann novel, Death in Venice, is an amazing piece of writing in terms of describing a male dealing with aging, almost in a way that a lot of American TV and sitcoms over-personify the postmenopausal hysterical female of the 50s. Women now are engaged professionally way beyond menopause, and those representations no longer exist, but the idea of the crone in ageism still exists. So I thought that piece of writing, even though it was written for a male, was so significant in responding to Luchino Visconti's film, which is shot so beautifully. And as an aging woman, I thought, okay, I'm going to Venice anyway. I'm going to actually shoot this on the Lido. And so for me, the interesting element was I'm responding to a piece of male writing that is very female sensitive, even for a male character. And it's played by a male, but I don't, although I wear a similar suit to Dirk Bogarde in the shoot, I am very much interested in maintaining the female identity. It clearly was, ageism was just as much of a construct to me as Tadeuse in the film was a construct of beauty for Aschenbach, the character. So, you know, just always dealing with that construct that consumerism puts forward builds a construct to ageism for older women was important for me to kind of unravel in that work.
Well, what I see, actually, I have to tell you, in Lipstick on the Lido, is not the wrinkle around the mouth. it's funny. It's the dissociation of the mouth from the image of the face. And this is very strong because it means that when you look at your mouth in the small mirror, you don't see your whole face because the mirror is too small. And in the final image, which is for me very strong, in terms of, you know, reflection about aging, also it's that dissociation that allows you not to look at yourself, because you just look at your mouth, and this will allow us to go back to "Are you talking to me?" to close that conversation, because it's all about the mouth also. Like, but we see you with closed eyes. It's like a series of good and bad portraits, I would say. But the fact of looking at your mouth, you know, like you're talking, is something that is disturbing, because normally in portraits, you know, the mouth is closed. And that's also an open mouth we see in Lipstick on the Lido. My last question would be, how would you like your work to be talking to people today?
Well, that's actually a hard question to answer. I mean, I am so thrilled by your questions and comments and our discussion that the work that I have done is in fact talking to you. And I hope that my work will continue talking in the future. What's of interest to me is, as the author of this work, is that work throughout my whole production seems to actually have second and third lives, that people will tell me, oh my goodness, it's just as pertinent to what's happening in the world today as it was in the 70s. And if my work can actually be relived in the context of a later time, I'm happy.